Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first online meeting of the Tucson Chapter of the Arizona Native Plant Society. And tonight I'm delighted to introduce a presentation by Perin McNelis from Borderlands Restoration, a nonprofit organization located in Patagonia, Arizona. Perin has been affiliated with this group for about 5 years, but she came to it by a circuitous route. She actually is from Tucson and was inspired by a teacher here who some of you may know, Margaret Welch, a science teacher at Tucson High, and was inspired in science and botany. But then she went to New York University and studied dance and anthropology. But eventually she made her way back to California studying botany, and now is currently the assistant program manager at Borderlands Restoration. Some of her activities in this role include working with schools and other partner organizations in environmental education, and helping people to be aware of and to appreciate the local landscape is something that is especially rewarding for her. She also manages the Seed Lab and the plant collection programs. And tonight she's going to share her experiences and knowledge about a borderland restoration initiative that is identifying and conserving wild crop relatives and wild utilized species. So please welcome her and let's enjoy her presentation.
So hi everybody, my name's Perin. Thanks for the lovely intro, Susie. I'm the assistant program manager for our native plant program at Borderlands Restoration Network here in Patagonia, Arizona. And my presentation today is called Crop Wild Relatives in the Tumacacori Highlands, and a little bit outside of that in southeastern Arizona. I'm going to talk a bit about the work we've been doing in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and the Agricultural Resource Service, focused on crop wild relatives in southeastern Arizona. And then I'd also just like to highlight some of the botanical magic of that region that I've come across during my survey work, because it's so incredible. All right, so I'm going to first give you a really quick background to our native plant program, if you haven't heard of it, at Borderlands Restoration Network. So we started in 2012, and the native plant program grew out of a need for regionally sourced container plants and seed for use by restoration practitioners. And our mission is to promote and protect biodiversity and ecosystems in the Sky Islands by providing access to restoration quality plant materials. So we do seed collection services. We keep really thorough documentation of provenance information. We clean, curate, and store seeds at our seed lab. And then our collection today has over 500 accessions and hundreds of different species. And then we have a nursery facility where we propagate wild collected seeds and cuttings, and it's located at the top 5 acres of the Native Seed Search Conservation Farm. And there we do container grow outs for large and small scale restoration projects, from public lands to home pollinator gardens. And we also have a farmed seed increaser plot. And the whole program is managed by Francesca Clavery. And this is just a page showing a quick overview of kind of like the diversity of projects that we get to work on at our native plant materials program. And I think I get so excited about these projects because I think our most interesting and important projects focus on how people have interacted with landscapes and how those interactions can be more mutually beneficial and promote landscape resiliency. So some of the really cool ones are we've done a lot of work with Bat Conservation International and groups in Sonora, propagating and planting agaves for restoration for the lesser long-nosed bat. And agaves are disappearing with habitat loss and development, and also Somebody's there in a car or muted. Okay, anyway, so we plant out these agaves as increased pressures on production of agave distillates are diminishing habitat that's really important for different pollinators. We work with emery oaks, which are in decline. We do a lot of cool work with abandoned agricultural fields and experimenting with how to kind of revert those abandoned ag fields back into native grassland so they don't just turn into giant tumbleweed fields. And then we work a little bit with some sensitive and endangered species. This past year, we've worked with Pectus imberbus, the beardless chinchweed, and some of the orchids and the cienegas in southeastern Arizona. And then, so I feel like the crop wild relative work kind of fits right in that, where, except for the sensitive and endangered species, which is less in this kind of human cultural overlap. The crop wild relative work is just really cool, and I feel like is so important and tells a really interesting story. So what is a crop wild relative? And I know that's confusing because everybody wants to say wild crop relative. And they're technically called crop wild relative, CWR. It's a little strange grammatically, but that's the name. And what are they? And why are they important? So as defined by the Forest Service, a crop wild relative is a plant species occurring in the quote unquote wild that is a species from which a crop was domesticated, or a closely related species, which is generally in the same genus, to a particular domesticated crop species. So wild crop relatives may contribute genetic material to the crop species, which can provide for increased disease resistance, fertility, crop yield, or other desirable traits. And almost every species of plant that we've domesticated and cultivate currently has one or more crop wild relatives. So plants, are modified through cultivation to suit our needs. And then occasionally we abandon the use of crop wild relatives once we've once we've reached our cultivar. And in most cases though, the ancestor continues to grow in the wild. So why are they important? So as we face unprecedented climate catastrophe, as you've seen with our current fires happening all over California and the Northwest, future food security is more important than ever. In this photo, I just have this pamphlet that was made by Gary Nabhan and Colin Corey. It's really great. I recommend you checking it out if you haven't seen it. And those two have advocated for crop wild relative protection and research in our region for decades. And they write, quote, that to produce good, affordable food while reducing the environmental impacts of production, more diversity will be needed, both in the variety of plants cultivated or foraged for the market and in the genetic variation within domesticated crops. And crop wild relatives offer the world both of these gifts. So crop wild relatives that have adaptations for surviving and thriving, especially in hot and dry conditions like we have here, they seem especially pertinent for the future of food security in the face of global warming. And then in their paper called Trans Situ Conservation of Crop Wild Relatives, Gary Nabhan and our partner Aaron Riordan advocate for integrating in situ and ex situ strategies for crop wild relative conservation by ramping up protective measures for landscapes where crop wild relatives grow, but also maintaining ex situ backup in gene banks and simultaneously promoting education, research, and relationship building with these plants. So our crop wild relative work at BRN is just a starting point that kind of stemmed from this trans situ approach. And Gary Nabhan really advocated for this work to be done with the Forest Service and Agricultural Resource Service. So our work with crop wild relatives started last year, 2019, and it's been primarily focused in the wild Chile botanical area, which I have on the map here, in the Tumacacori Highlands, just across I-19 from the Tumacacori Mission. So it's a 2,836 acre area. It's under the management of the Coronado National Forest, and it was designated in 1999 to protect the northernmost natural population of the chiltepin pepper, which you all probably know, Capsicum annuum variety Glabriosculum, which is the wild ancestor of many cultivated peppers. And this special area was also created to provide protection and research opportunities for both the wild Chile and other plants of economic importance or conservation concern. And there's at least 45 species of crop wild relatives that are occurring in the watershed containing the wild Chile botanical area. And actually more than that, as Erin Riordan and I have learned from creating these lists, target species lists. And that's within the east side of the Tumacacori Mountains on the Nogales Ranger District. And many of these crop wild relative species have proven or potential uses as crop genetic resources for improvement of domesticated crops already being grown commercially in Arizona and the rest of the US and the world. So in 2019, last year, the URN played a small role in a project that USFS was working on with support from the USDA Agricultural Resource Service to conduct a really thorough botanical inventory of the wild Chile botanical area. So we supported this survey work, which was led by biologists from the Forest Service Enterprise Program. They're like the hot shots of like the natural, of biologists or naturalists, where they just get to travel all over the US doing all kinds of different really cool survey work. And then at Borderlands, our team used the geolocations from the surveys to collect voucher specimens and seed that went to national germplasm banks for research focused on the crop and its relatives of whatever was collected. So this year, we're continuing the project and expanding on it slightly. The primary objective of the project this year is to continue locating and inventorying the crop wild relatives and to collect seeds and voucher specimens of priority species for conservation and research. And this is being done primarily in the wild Chile botanical area and the Coronado National Forest land in the Tumacacori Highlands, and a little bit in the Santa Rita Mountains and Patagonia Mountains for species not observed in the wild Chile botanical area. So results of plant inventories for the crop wild relatives will be used then to determine if further protective designation is needed for the wild Chile botanical area, and if it should be pursued as an important genetic resource reserve, or IGRR, another type of protective designation. And that would be for protecting plant species in addition to the wild Chile. So you may have noticed that I said priority species. What does that mean? So there are over 300 taxa of crop wild relatives present in this kind of Tumacacori Highland region where the wild Chile botanical area lives. So you may be wondering, like, what list of crop wild relatives are you working off of? What criteria do we use to narrow down such a long list in order to prioritize species that maybe have more urgent research and conservation needs, and to have a more targeted strategy for survey and seed collection work when we do have limited timeline, limited people and funds. So this is where Erin Riordan, our incredible partner in this project, and others, who's a plant ecologist and researcher, this is where she comes in. So she compiled this list. So there wasn't a comprehensive list for the Tumacacori Highlands of crop wild relatives. So she compiled a list, and basically she combined plant lists from agency florists through SciNet, scientific papers. She's talked a lot with botanical experts like your own Jack Dash and others. And then she compiled a list that way, and then she updated the taxonomy on the list using the Taxonomic Name Resolution Service. And then she cross-checked that list with national inventories of crop wild relatives and important wild utilized species for the broader United States. And that was work done by Colin Corey, who I mentioned earlier, who's a really amazing crop wild relative researcher. And those broader national lists have priority designations for conservation, priority 1A, 1B, and 1C, and those are based on relatedness to important agricultural and horticultural crops. So then she looked at occurrence localities for herbarium vouchers and germplasm accessions for all of the 1A, 1B, and 1C crop wild relatives on her list that were collected in southern Arizona that she looked at through SciNet and Colin Corey's work. And then she mapped those occurrences to help guide our survey work in wild Chile botanical area and the nearby public lands. So that first list that she made had over 300 taxa of crop wild relatives, as I had mentioned, and wild utilized species, both native and non-native. And 67 wild native taxa are known to occur within the wild Chile botanical area, or Rock Corral Canyon, which is the canyon that runs right through the wild Chile area. So then she prioritized that list for our field surveys using the 1A, 1B, 1C model that Colin Corey had put together. She also used level of XC2 conservation need, urgent, high, moderate, low, based on Colin Corey's work as well. The number and geographic distribution of XC2 collections in Southern Arizona to try to fill in gaps. And then national and state level in situ threat status based on nature served conservation status rankings and in situ conservation need scores from Colin Corey's work as well. So we made our list. Oh, sorry, I missed that one, germplasm collections as well. Here is the working list. It's still pretty long, but these are just our 1A, 1B, 1C, and there are some lower priority ones as well. And we're not prioritizing non-native crop wild relatives or wild utilized species at this time, even though we both would love to. So now I'm just gonna kind of look over some of these sexy plants because a lot of them are really cool. A lot of them you'll see are just extremely common and you've seen them all over the place in Southern Arizona. But I just wanna give you kind of a quick overview and then focus in on a few of my favorites and then move on from there. So first we have, of course, the chiltepine, Capsicum annuum, variety glabriosculum. Beautiful picture here is one I took in the wild Chile botanical area, relative of mother of all chili peppers. There it is again, looking good. That's in a little side drainage of Rock Corral Canyon. And then we have a bunch of priority 1A species. Here we have the prairie sunflower, which is obviously relative of the cultivated sunflower, Helianthus petiolaris. Then we have our common sunflower, Helianthus annuus, the annual variety, grows huge. And then we have our wild tepary bean, which is relative of the cultivated tepary as well as the lima bean. I'm sorry that some of my photos don't have flowers, and I'm trying to get better at getting my camera out in the field and taking good plant photos, but I have borrowed a lot from SciNet, you'll see later. These ones Travis took, who's also been working in the field with me. But this one is climbing up, and you can see in the right-hand photo, there's some pods hanging off of that vine. And then our Arizona canyon grape, Vitis arizonica. And then we have two priority 1A species. You can't see it so well, but it's a canyon grape covering an Arizona black walnut, Juglans major, which is there it is again. And then we have these ones I didn't have photos of, the golden currant, relative of currants and gooseberry, and our common hops, relative of hops, obviously. Desert cotton and bottle brush grass, which is a relative of wheat. And then we have, and those were all 1A species. I think that's our entire list. And then these are just a couple 1B species priority. Oh, sorry, all of those, the desert cotton, the bottle brush were also 1B. So this 1B species is the coyote gourd, as you know, relative of zucchini, squash, pumpkins, and others. There it is at my old house. My yard was just covered in it. Such an amazing plant. Comes out, like emerges so early. It created this incredible ground cover that kept so much moisture in the ground that was otherwise, not such great soil. And then at the end of the season, it has these beautiful little, like, yellow balls everywhere. And then the fingerleaf gourd, which is one of my favorites. I saw you guys just posted a photo of that on your Instagram today, which had a beautiful flower. Sorry, I don't have a picture of the flower in this one. Really cool gourd, also relative of zucchini, squash, pumpkin, etc. And then we have a couple of our solanums, which we're moving on to 1C priority highlights. Silverleaf nightshade, very common, relative of all different nightshade crops. Tomato, eggplant, potato. This is one of my favorites, the Solanum douglasii, the green spot nightshade, relative of tomato, eggplant, potato. Also sometimes called chichicalite, which I know is like used for other solanums as well. I really like that one though too. So far, you guys have probably noticed that except for maybe that ribes, humulus, and gossypium, a lot of the priority 1A and 1B species that I have mentioned so far are like quite common. You're probably very familiar with them. And a lot of them are actually really disturbance loving, which is interesting because the wild Chile botanical area actually lacks a lot of disturbance. It has one road that splits, so it's like basically two really rough roads that goes into it. It's not visited very often. It's not super accessible. And it's well protected, so it lacks a lot of disturbance. It doesn't have the same kind of grazing activity that you might see on other Forest Service lands. So a lot of those ones that I had mentioned are surprisingly less common in the wild Chile botanical area, even though you would think of them as being really prevalent everywhere. Anyway, on to some of my favorites now. This is Nicotiana obtusifolia, relative of tobacco. And these ones, we had to hike up at this just super rough hillside under this cliff. It was growing like in this sandy bank in the shade of this giant rock face. And you'll see though these ones, some of them were growing right out of the rock there. And you might notice with these, they look kind of crispy actually. And that was something I've really noticed this year too with our lack of precipitation this monsoon season. Everything looks I've been seeing everything looks pretty stressed. And these ones, even though I visited them 2 weeks or even 3 weeks before the enterprise logged this point last year and logged it as like all fully flowering, when I was there, they were almost all done flowering. I found like 2 still flowers that were not dried up and they had all gone to seed. So it seemed almost like they had kind of bolted out of stress too. So that's been a challenge a little bit this year too, with especially trying to capture flowering for the vouchers and stuff seeming like at least some species seeming like the timing isn't totally on with our lack of rains. But anyway, I love that tobacco. It smells amazing. It's such a cool plant. And then we have our maniots. So desert mountain maniot, relative of cassava. And this picture, you can't see the leaves. It's got these really amazing palmate leaves with these long tapered lobes. And then we have Arizona maniote. Those are both 1B species, both relatives of the cassava. And this is similar to the maniote angustiloba, but its palmate leaves, they're like less tapered at the end. They have these funny like broad protrusions at the apex of the lobe, which you can kind of see in this photo. And this photo I took a few weekends ago when we had those like 3 days of sweet, like hurricane rains almost. And it was just so happy. You could just see it like thrilled and just like feeling so good. And then we have a ton of ipomoeas in our 1C category. They're all related to the sweet potato. These are a couple of the 2 really common ones. And then we have Ipomea longeifolia, which is one of my favorite plants. It doesn't grow that far into Arizona. It's not super common. It's mostly down in the southeastern corner. And it grows out of these like pure sand areas. And it has these huge white and pink tubular flowers, just gorgeous. Estrella de la Mañana is one of its common names. And I just love that one. And then last but not least, this is actually my plant of the year. Every year I kind of like fall in love with a new plant and just get really obsessed with it. And I love Tripsicum lanceolatum. This is Mexican gamma grass, relative of maize or corn, although you'll notice it's not the same genus, it's not Zea. And it's my personal favorite though. And it reminds me of Johnson grass, which I know sounds terrible, but it's just like big and like lush and sexy, but it's also not a horrible invasive that creates these monotypic stands the way Johnson grass does and like wipes everything out. It's actually been really hard for me to find. This one is a roadside one where we have this one patch where there's a ton of them down in near Patagonia. Big bunch grass, really gorgeous. And then you'll also notice, I tried to get some up close pictures, that it has these, in the right hand picture, you'll see it has the female flowering parts, the little pistils sticking out. And you can't see it quite well in this picture, but the upper part is where you'd see the little stamen coming out. So it's very similar to corn in that way. So that's about it for my really quick overview of highlighted crop wild relative species. And although many of the priority 1A and 1B species are disturbance loving, as I had mentioned, and are therefore not present in abundance in the wild Chile botanical area, the wild Chile botanical area is still one of the most botanically interesting places I've ever been. And the incredible plants that grow there definitely deserve the protection, whether or not they're crop wild relatives. There's just like no other place like this in my mind. It feels similar to so many other spots, and we have, you know, like hints of it out Solero in the foothills of the Santa Rita Mountains, but it just feels like the species composition there, it feels like very unique, and the Madrean influence feels so palpable. There's almost this like subtropical feel in some of the canyons. And so I just want to show off some of the really beautiful, plants I've come across. It's just a handful. There was a ton of hibiscus culturi, a ton of Amarexia palmatifida, which is one of my favorite wild utilized species, a ton of choicea, or not a ton of, but still some really amazing large plants of choicea demosa, and then Passiflora arizonica in the middle there, which is a forest designated sensitive species, and they're also very interested in protecting that. And then Aurelia humilis, which to me is just, is like such a cool carrot family plant. And then last but not least, I have a few. I actually can't remember what the one on the left is. I asked Jack a while back. I want to say it's a Gonalobus or a Metalia species, some kind of milk vine, super cool. And then we have the Eisenhardia orthocarpa, the kidney wood, with these incredible fragrant blooms, which the pollinators love. It smells amazing. There's a ton of it at the Wild Chile Botanical Area. And then Muhlenbergia demosa, or bamboo muley, which I don't have a good picture of. I'm sorry, it's because they looked a little bit crispy, or the ones that I just came across when I was doing surveying work last week were a little crispy, but it's just such a cool plant. So that concludes my beautiful plant photos. So then I just really quickly have some of the challenges that I mentioned are the terrain in the Wild Chile Botanical Area is super rough. Sometimes I've had like a day where I've hiked around and like collected 2 vouchers because it's just took so long to get into these areas, like into some of the areas using the mapping information that I got from the Enterprise crew last year. So that makes things a little bit slower. And when you're trying to cover such a long list, like the one I showed you, it's a big challenge. Always limited time and funding, always a challenge. The lack of disturbance, which is a great thing, but it's also like, oh yeah, there's not a lot of these, there's not a ton of common sunflower there. And then the lack of a good monsoon season this year seems to have stressed a lot of the plants. So next steps, these are just things that I personally am like excited about and that I'd like to see with a lot of this work moving forward, is more education around crop wild relatives, and then especially wild utilized species. And then more, I don't know if this is the right word, but more relational XT2 conservation strategies. So that build in interaction with the plants, people-plant interaction, growing and tending these plants both in the quote-unquote wild and in maybe garden type of settings. Broader inventory efforts that include wild utilized species, and prioritization measures that take into account regional cultural importance in addition to economic value. And I know Erin Riordan and I have talked about this. I know both of us are super excited about the idea of potentially in the future doing a more like large scale inventory effort that would include crop wild relatives and wild utilized species, more for like the Madrean archipelago, so like a binational southern Arizona, northern Sonora region. And then these are just some pictures of wild utilized species that I think are cool. So Amarexia palmatifida, so cool, and you can eat pretty much all of it. Lycium, you guys know that one. It was on our crop wild relatives list last year, but I guess more distant related one, and like like the goji berry. And then emery oak acorns, which are just like incredible for any living thing to eat, and are super low in tannins and can be used for flour and in all kinds of other ways. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you so much.